Next on the schedule, we have Dr. John Campbell. John is a clinical development director at GlaxoSmithKline in Collegeville, Pennsylvania. He's currently the clinical lead for the ongoing global clinical trial in PBC pruritus patients. John is trained in pharmacology and has been working in clinical research for about 20 years, he says. He won't give me the accurate time, so you be the judge of his age. But his passion in drug development for rare diseases, he serves on the board of directors for the patient advocacy group Rare New England and lives in Pottstown, Pennsylvania. Please welcome John.
Thank you very much. So first off, thank you for the introduction. It's been about 20 years, but I did start when I was 12. So, you know, I want to thank, first I give disclosures. I am an employee of GlaxoSmithKline in the research and development area, and I'm the clinical lead for the PBC trial that is ongoing, as was mentioned. I also am on the board of directors of Rare New England in Boston, which is an organization very similar to the BBCers, a bit smaller, so we look up to the BBCers to get better. Again, I will deny anything that I say that's controversial, and that certainly should not reflect on my employer, so the views expressed are mine and not those of GSK. I want to really thank the PBCers organization. They've done a great job. And it's been great with Lenny and Carol and the whole team there. And for the record, I did complete the puzzle piece, Carol. It's a privilege to be included in this very distinguished group of speakers. It's sort of like when you buy a house in a neighborhood, you want to buy the one that's the lowest so that your stock goes up. So my stock's going to go up. So I'm good about that. So I've learned a lot here already at this conference. The first thing is that from Dr. Pate, sorry, better? The first thing I learned from Dr. Pate is that I likely have the diagnosis of media agitation syndrome. I don't know if that's an actual DSM entity, but I'm going to find out. Also, I learned that I have been mispronouncing chronically Ocaliva, but I've since been corrected, so now I know that. I also learned that Dr. Gershwin has some really cool fish. So I'm going to talk about clinical trials today, and it's a very broad topic. You know, and I really, I tried to make it so that it's patient-focused. There's a lot of terminology that's used in pharma. That's what we do. I can get whole emails that are nothing but acronyms, some of which I don't understand. So I will try to explain them when they're used. Some can't be avoided. So I think I've heard here and elsewhere in also my Rare New England work, there's a lot of interest in clinical trials at the patient level, and that's really encouraging. Also, I've heard that there's not a lot of information at the patient level about clinical trials, where to go, what they're about. And there's even some misinformation. So hopefully today this will be a little bit of a step forward, and we'll show some resources that you can go to get information on the trials. If anyone doubts the importance of clinical trials in this area of therapeutics, I will say that we all agree that a cure for rare diseases such as PBC, we all would like a cure. But I will tell you with 100% certainty that that cure will not come without clinical trials. So that's the importance of them, and keep that in mind as I go along. Before I start, I want to just sort of get a lay of the land. How many folks here have participated in a clinical trial or are participating? Okay. How many people have not, but would consider it? Is there anyone that would never consider it no matter what? Dr. Mayo would never consider it. She is a principal investigator in the trial that I do, so she's great, by the way. And then the fourth one, is there anyone here that designs clinical trials or, besides Dr. Mayo, is a PI in the study? Good, so I can say whatever I want then. So once again, thanks to the PVC organization. They've really been fantastic. And understanding clinical trials is a process, and it is a process from start to finish. It's a long process. I'll show you some facts and figures that will give you a sense of that. It's basically the process of determining whether or not a drug is safe to take and effective at what it's being intended, what its intended use is. It's a very specific definition, though. It's not just in anybody. It's in a population that you define up front, and we'll talk about some of that. And in many ways, the clinical trials are the end game, which means, a lot of work has been done up to the point where you can begin clinical trials, preclinical work, work at the bench, discovery work. And it's my personal perspective, and I know my colleagues here as well as elsewhere in the pharma industry who do clinical trials share this perspective. It's a huge responsibility to many stakeholders, and these include patients that are waiting for a cure, a potential cure, patients who are considering or have already participated in earlier clinical trials with the asset, and researchers who have worked tirelessly to advance the drug candidate up to the point where you can do clinical trials. And I would hate to disappoint Dr. Gershwin, for instance, and his special mice that we saw yesterday. So just some quick numbers to get a sense that drug development is definitely not for the faint of heart. And again, these numbers, please, are variable and they depend on a lot of things. And there's some controversy over some of the dollar amounts. But I'm talking here really from development, from the bench lab to approval. So the average time can be 10 to 15 years. That's pretty long. The average cost can be anywhere from $1.2 to $2.6 billion, especially in a big pharmaceutical company. It can be lower. The small companies, biotechs, tend to be a little bit faster, a little bit more expensive out of necessity. The success rate is very low, especially when you look at from discovery to approval. That should not be 10%. Math is not my best thing, but clearly that's not 10%. But the estimated success, once you start trials, so sort of phase 1 to phase 3, and your submission is about 1 out of 5, 20%. 80% fail, and that's after a huge expenditure of resources to get that far. And then on the far right, you see in phase 3, what are the major reasons where drugs do fail in this period of time shown. And you see efficacy 64%, so it's not working as it intended, which can be subtle. There's safety issues about 27%, and other is about 9%. So my friend persuaded me to use this slide, and I don't know how it's going to go, but it'll give you a sense of the cost. Right now, like if we had something we wanted to put into space, like a satellite, thank God that's not mine, to spy on another pharmaceutical company, like if I wanted to peer into the windows at Intercept somehow, I could pay $120 $130 million and get my stuff launched into space. And if you look at it, and if you believe the numbers that I just said, we could fund about 20 of those launches for the cost of developing a single drug. So it's hugely expensive. So clinical trials, again, it's human research that is designed to test both the safety and the efficacy of a drug for an intended use. And that is a specific population of patients with a specific disease, and sometimes even those details get more narrow as well, such as age, stage of disease. It can be very narrow. A clinical trial never stands alone. It's always part of a clinical development program. And that program is detailed up front in a very comprehensive way from the beginning to the end, detailing the plans for your trials. And then you sit down with the FDA and they tell you everything that's wrong with it, and then you fix it. So it really is a process that builds on itself, and what you learn along the way, you can incorporate, and you usually do make changes as you go. The whole goal of this is to determine what's called the risk-benefit, which is the ratio of safety to efficacy. And I'll touch on this specifically because this is a very important point. Remember risk-benefit. A lot of things go into that, the data, of course, but also in the intended disease therapeutic area, are there other drugs out there that are used to treat the same thing? What is the severity? If the disease you are treating is lethal, then clearly that can affect the risk-benefit ratio. In rare disease scenarios, there can be additional considerations that impact that risk-benefit ratio. A lot of those are incentives for the drug companies to develop drugs in very small populations, but there are other considerations, as you'll see in a second. Despite the differences, I want to stress that it doesn't relieve one's responsibility to generate data that conclusively shows to the regulatory agencies that your drug is both safe and effective. In my experience, that is a common misconception, and that in a rare disease situation, you can just pull together a couple trials real fast and run it, even if the data is a little bit shoddy. You still might get approval. That's not the case. The standards for the data remain the same, and the FDA will hold you to that. And I want to talk a little bit about the phases of the trials. So they range from phase 1 to phase 4. 1 through 3 are pre-approval. I'll talk about 4. So phase 1 is generally safety focused, most often in healthy volunteers, so people who do not have the disease that you will eventually treat. It's a small number of participants. You're using data that you've generated earlier on, either in animals or in other models, to find a dose. And it can be, and usually is, first time that you've exposed a human being to this drug in this setting. The phase 2 get a little bit bigger. Here you start to look at effectiveness. You can draw distinctions between the word effectiveness and the word efficacy. For our purposes here, I'll just say effectiveness. You really can't judge efficacy in a small number of patients like that. But you are now moving into, in phase 2, the disease population that you eventually are looking to gain approval in. You do some more definitive dose ranging study and pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics usually. Pharmacokinetics is a big word. It's simply determining what your body does to the drug. absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. How long does it stay in there? Where does it go in the body? And then pharmacodynamics is what the drug does to the body. In phase 3, again, this is the largest phase, and this can be multiple studies where you are looking very vigorously in a well-controlled trial at the efficacy and safety in the intended population. At any one of these phases, you can have comparators, usually placebo in most cases. In some cases, particularly lethal diseases, usually in oncology trials, there'll be an active comparator, which will be the standard of care, which is simply defined as what is currently used to treat that disease. And your drug or potential drug will be compared to that. I've added the word pivotal under phase 3. Pivotal, you might hear thrown about. That just means that it is a study that's intended to be used for the submission that will be reviewed by the regulatory agencies for approval. And everything needs to be neatly buttoned up and very well done for a study to be pivotal. Phase 4 occurs after approval of the drug, and that's testing it for a different disease, maybe a different patient population, a different dose, and again, that is usually done in a medical affairs setting, and will change the label of the drug as it stands, as it was approved. I've tried to pull together some key roles in a trial, and many of you may know these, many of you will not. You can see that I have 4 words up there for the people that are in the clinical trial. And this is part of the neuroses of pharma, in that, is it a patient? You can argue. The word subject sometimes can be construed as being not very nice. And a volunteer, yeah, they volunteer. However, that sometimes is reserved to those patients in the phase 1 trials who are called healthy volunteers. So there's some confusion potentially. So at GSK at least, we use the word participant, or we try to. The sponsor, usually pharma, but it can be an investigator as well, an academic investigator doing investigator-sponsored trials, but for our purposes, it's pharma. There's untold numbers of functions within pharma that run clinical trials, from CMC, from the chemical people, the chemistry, the formulation, to safety, to handling the data, the really smart people that are called statisticians. And the sponsor legally is defined as the holder of the investigational new drug application. So that's what you file with the FDA when you're interested in engaging in a clinical development plan and a series of trials, often referred to as IND. The principal investigator, or PI, leads the site team and provides medical oversight and is responsible for what goes on at their center. In a typical trial, if we look at the Glimmer trial that Dr. Mayo mentioned, there's upwards of 66 sites, so we have 66 PIs, 1 for each center. There's also the very important role of study coordinator, who helps the very busy investigator manage everything that's going on, deals with the documentation. That's a very important role. And if you're involved in a trial, you will get to know the coordinator well. There's also a pharmacy. Sometimes it's very simple if you have a tablet that you're looking at, but it can be for gene therapy, for instance, a very complicated process where specialists are involved. You have the Institutional Review Board, which is a group of individuals who are charged with reviewing on behalf of the patients that will be at their center the safety of what's going to happen to them in the trial. So they look at the protocol, They look at, whether or not the information that's been presented to the patient explaining the trial is appropriate and not unduly enticing. So that's a very important role and someone that we deal with closely. There can be central IRBs, which you can have one IRB that looks at all the centers in your study, or you can have one for each one. Academic centers usually have their own IRB and are extremely difficult to deal with, by the way. But they serve a very important role. The regulatory authority, which in the United States is the FDA, that does not stand for our friends who don't approve. It stands for the Food and Drug Administration. And really, in all fairness, they are overworked, without enough resources, and they have way too much to do. And I give them a lot of credit because it's a hard job, and it's very hard to decide these applications sometimes. And I think you've seen over the last several years a very strong movement at the FDA towards making sure that drug developers take into account the patient perspective. When I first started doing this, you would pay verbal homage to patients, but not really consider their perspective when you're designing trials. And, I had an experience where, that was firsthand for me, and I really try to do that now because it's very important. It's also important, as you'll see in the next couple slides, that the endpoints you use, what you measure as an improvement, is meaningful to the patient. We can all measure the change in ALP phos or ALT, which is important as an indicator of disease. But if you have an ALP phos that's a little lower than the week before, that's not really helping you so much in your daily life. I also added as a key role in the clinical trial process, your personal care provider, your personal physician, who you should be in touch with. They're a very good resource of information, and your specialist, your hepatologist in this case. Also the patient advocates, as you'll see, like the PDCers, they can be an enormous source of very relevant information and also put you in touch with patients who are considering a trial or have been completed one. And then the caregiver. Caregivers, I think, increasing attention on the burden that's placed on them. They play a very important role for helping patients manage through the challenges of disease. Some other elements of trials, the informed consent, I'll get into that in detail in a second. The clinical protocol. This is the Bible, if you will, of a trial. It's pre-specified instructions as what needs to happen in every step. Nothing happens that's not in there, and everything happens that is in there, or it better, or it creates a deviation. And we're all afraid of deviations. The exception being if the investigator who's charged with medical oversight of the patients in the trial, they can intervene and do things that they judge to be medically necessary on behalf of the patient in an emergency or otherwise. And then we have clinicians inside the company who they can be in touch with to consult. So again, this protocol is for one trial, one clinical trial, part of an overall clinical development plan. The IND application I explained a little bit before, otherwise known as the IND. You have a pre-IND meeting with the FDA where they approve sort of your plan, and then you have steps along the way. At the end of phase 2, for instance, you have an end of phase 2 meeting where you look at the data generated so far and revisit your phase 3 plans, and hopefully, the adjustments you've made based on those data are right, and you can proceed. They can say stop. The new drug application is where you'd like to get to. That's when you've completed your trials, you've assembled it all into a nice little package, with a beautiful red bow and some nice wrapping, and you send it off to Bethesda, and they look at it, and hopefully they say yes. Publications, this is an important piece, and I noticed in the survey that was done by the PBCers, folks didn't know if their data was going to be published, and if it was, they didn't know. So this is very important for pharma, particularly GSK, because it's a responsibility we have to publish all data. And we publish it professionally in the journals, abstracts at certain scientific congresses, AASLD, EASD, for instance. But we also have a public database that one can access where all of the data that's generated in interventional trials is stored. Whether or not it's a drug trial or just an observational trial, it's all in there. And I think this is increasingly important as the patient perspective becomes we become more aware of that, this is going to be more prevalent. So I promised you about the informed consent. Informed consent is critical if you're considering a trial. It is what explains everything about it for you, the potential participant, why it's being done, the drug that's being used, the time commitment that you're going to have, the number of visits, how long those visits might take, how much blood may be drawn for the samples that are needed, what procedures you will have to go through. Hopefully it's not the nasobiliary drainage that Dr. Mayo showed you pictures of. In Glimmer, we don't have that, thank goodness. It also goes through sort of subtle points that might not seem important, but it is important. And that is, in a trial, you might have several arms. They're called arms, and that's just maybe a different dose of the drug. But one of those arms could also be placebo. And this informed consent is going to tell you what the chances of you, each individual patient, has of getting placebo or one of the other doses of the drug. It's also the informed consent, otherwise known as the IC, will describe the potential risks and the potential benefits of your participation in the trial, and your rights pertaining to the trial, your rights to the data, your rights to discontinue, and very importantly, if you stop for any reason, you withdraw your consent, that the provision of health care will not be affected at all. And that's an important piece. I can't stress more, you really should understand this and ask questions. As we heard today and yesterday, it's really important to be an advocate for your own care and to understand the best you can the disease. And part of that comes with questions and talking with other folks as well. So some other special topics, the placebo, we don't do placebos to be mean. We do placebos because generally that is one of the best ways to determine if your drug is actually having the effect it wants or you want relative to giving nothing. Typically, if you can, you will give standard of care plus a placebo versus your drug at different doses. Sometimes that's not feasible. But in order for you to demonstrate to the FDA that your drug is working, that comparison is frequently necessary. Again, the exception being in lethal diseases and oncology. You'll hear the word randomization, blinding, double blind, single blind. These are ways that you can design a trial such that you minimize bias. And also smooth out some of the co-founders. I talked to someone last night who was wondering, how if you have a patient who's very vigorous about their exercise and is very good with their diet, and you have patients who are not, how do you account for that in a trial? And the way that you do it, for the most part, is that you randomize it so that there's statistics that you can use and procedures so that the entry into the trial is random, and that those differences across all the patients in the study are going to be smoothed out. And then there's ways also to track that so that you can pull that out at the end. The blinding really is to eliminate bias. You'd be amazed at how much bias there can be. I did pain trials for a long time with opioids, and it's not unusual to have 40% of your patients claim that they've had relief of pain when all they're getting is placebo. And that's at the patient level, the participant level. We don't like to believe it, but the investigators can also have some bias. So frequently there's a period of the study, or all of it, that is double-blind, so that neither the investigator nor the patient knows what the patient is getting. That can be broken in an emergency on behalf of the patient's welfare. Now, some of the differences in rare disease clinical trials quickly, mostly on the sponsor side. You can have accelerated review times, and sometimes you can have less patients in a trial than you normally would have. Really, and some of the reasons for that, if you're doing a study in hypertension, you have years and years and years of data. You know what's going to happen if the patient is not treated. In rare disease, sometimes there could be so few patients, you don't know what's going to happen, and you don't have that data to rely on. So you could do your study and have this huge effect, and then have the FDA come and ask you, well, that's great, but if you didn't treat them, how do you know that that disease just didn't change over time? So it's an important consideration that makes rare disease trials more difficult to conduct, let alone the fewer number of patients. Trials can be stopped by the FDA, by the Safety Monitoring Committee, also be stopped by the sponsor. If we go in and look at and every patient that got a certain dose performed wildly good and the intended effect and everything was safe, it's not ethical to continue. So we would stop, most likely, and declare futility and proceed from there. Likewise, if there's a safety signal that's seen, that we need to go back and rethink about what we're doing, that can also be stopped for that reason. Compensation, generally, there is not direct compensation for patients who volunteer for a clinical trial. Personal expenses can be reimbursed. There also are provisions for injuries should that occur within the trial. For the early phase trials, phase 1 and 2, which can be long, which can require overnight stays at the clinical research center, there can be additional compensation for that investment in time that the patient is given to the trial. And I talked already about the dissemination of results. I promised you I'd talk also a little bit more in detail about benefit risk. And there's this white paper by the Parent Project for Muscular Dystrophy, co-written by a woman named Pat Furlong, who's a force of nature, if anyone knows her. She's really an advocate for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. And this paper does the best job I've ever seen of sort of dealing with the risk-benefit in a rare disease scenario. And it breaks it down into three main buckets. One, the regulator, which is the FDA, our friends in Bethesda. And their job, as mandated by Congress, is to protect the welfare of people, of patients in trials. They react very swiftly if some single person has an adverse event, serious one in a trial, but they struggle with respect to one individual person benefiting from a trial because they need to look at everybody. And their decisions are made more difficult sometimes because of that. But you also have the provider's concept or perception of risk-benefit, which can be very different than the regulators and different than the patients. First do no harm is rule number one, and providers are very interested in their patients' welfare, but it's usually from their perspective, which is an important one, but it's a single one, and most importantly, it's not the patient's one. And then you have the patient's perception, and this is what we are learning is more and more needs to be really first and foremost. Take, for instance, a rare disease drug that's being developed, and this rare disease is lethal. And the drug that you are researching in trials has the potential, say in 10% of the cases, to cause deafness. Ordinarily, the FDA would just stop you in your tracks. But, there are, and the one I'm thinking of really is parents were willing to take that chance to allow their children to become deaf in order to gain benefit from the potential disease. And that's a valid perspective from the patient. But it's a lot different than it is from the FDA. And this is especially true and poignant in the rare disease scenario. I mentioned the endpoints, and again, these are increasingly important that endpoints are clinically meaningful to the patient, not just a change in biochemistry markers. And clinically meaningful seems logical, but from a clinical trial design standpoint, they are hard. It could mean that you have to have a questionnaire, which has a lot of variability. Functional outcomes in some mitochondrial disease trials, you do a 6-minute walk, has a lot of variability, but it also improves. And then you have a lot of quality of life questionnaires. So some important online sources of information. And again, I stress when you're considering researching about a trial or a disease state, you have to consider the source. Who put the information there? Why did they put it there? Always access multiple sources of information. The ones I've chosen to list here are just a select few, but you can look at clinicaltrials.gov. Most people here are familiar with that. That's put out by the government. You have CenterWatch, which is a corporate service, but also very good and very comprehensive. The FDA has a number of websites that you can access from clinicaltrials.gov or just by Googling that are also helpful. I find it maddening to navigate that FDA website system, but there's good info there. There's also the patient advocacy groups, which again, like PVCers, are phenomenal sources of information, both from the disease state, but also from your fellow patient's perspective. Pharmaceutical company websites can be very good, but they're also disease-focused or drug-focused. And I can tell you with certainty that the information that's on there it is narrow out of necessity from some of the legal ramifications. And the National Organization of Rare Disease, NORD, also has a very good website and is a good resource for rare disease information. I picked just a couple here, and I'll put them both on the clinicaltrials.gov and CenterWatch. So if you just Google, you can see really a phenomenal amount of information that's available regarding clinical trials. You can search function, you can find specific studies or groups of studies. There's information about registering for a trial. There's information for researchers, patient families. It really is a good resource and something you should try to get familiar with if you're interested. CenterWatch, very similar. With the search function, they have a very good listing of drugs that are already approved and some information about those approvals that's helpful. Patient-focused information about volunteering for a trial and some training guides. And then we come to an example. I just happened to choose the PVCers as an example, of the patient advocacy resource that's available. So on the PBCers page, there's a description of what they do, but you can see also the things that they offer via the website to their members. And it's very comprehensive and very good information, and it's varied. And then you can see also that PBCers lists number of trials in PBC and some of their sponsors as well, where you can go to find individual drugs that may or may not be under investigation or that are approved. And they also kindly link to clinicaltrials.gov. So acknowledgements, I want to again thank the PBCers for the invitation. I think this is an important thing to get across, and I hope the download of information that I provided was helpful. Also like to thank my employer, GlaxoSmithKline, for supporting my attendance here, particularly my manager, Stuart Kendrick, who's a very nice guy and also happens to be a hepatologist located in the UK. Has been very supportive. But most and foremost, I'd like to thank the patients who have been in clinical trials and who will be in clinical trials. They're a never-ending source of inspiration for all of us in pharma, and they motivate us to continue what we're doing so that we can try to find a cure. Thank you. Okay.
You can stay on that side. So just a couple questions here. First off, we have a question where when participating or collaborating with other countries, is the process the same for those participants?
That's a very good question. At the patient level, yes. The protocol that you have for a study that is global, that protocol will be generally the same at the patient level. There can be differences in how the data is done. Some of the endpoints could be different based upon the regulatory authorities, but as a general rule, yes, it will be roughly the same.
Okay, great. And when there's several conditions involved, such as PBC, AIH, inflammatory bowel disease, is there an exception to some people are eliminated from a study because they have multiple conditions? Is there like a separate category for healthy individuals, PBC patients, and others? Do they ever kind of split it up to try to do it that way?
Yes, that's also a very good question, and it's something I didn't touch on because it could be the entire length of my talk. But in a study, there's eligibility criteria, inclusion criteria, and exclusion criteria. Those are there for two main reasons. One is to protect, first and foremost, the safety of the patients in the trial. We could not enroll a patient into a trial with a concomitant disease or disease of such severity where their participation would put them at risk. And that's just a fact of life, of clinical research. When you have other disorders that are liver-based, you do your best to be inclusive, especially in rare disease. You do not want to exclude people that could potentially benefit from the medicine. However, at the end of the day, you need to be able to make sense of the data. And if there's so many things going on with these other diseases that have potential to confound your interpretation of the data relative to, say, PBC, if it's autoimmune hepatitis or things, you tend to have to exclude people that won't be safe and would potentially confound the data.
Sorry, I want to keep it more pure for the data. So.
Yeah.
Another quick question as far as fast tracking a drug, and as far as the time frame, what's shortened, and is it common with rare diseases, medications in rare disease? Mm-hmm. And if you want to touch on that as well?
Sure. It is common to apply. You have to apply for these programs. The example here is Fast Track. What that does is it allows you sort of to get review by the FDA sooner than you normally would. The FDA, as I said, is working very hard, and they're backlogged, and it's months that they're behind. And the fast track, part of the judgment on their behalf to grant you fast track designation is, the potential that your drug has to cure the lethality of the disease that you're trying to treat. So it will potentially shorten the review time, which would allow you to incorporate feedback from the FDA sooner, and most likely shorten the entire process. All right, thank you.